Welcome to Fashion Futures Podcast. It's your host, Camila Sanders, and this season we are discussing Africa. We're connecting with industry experts and individuals on the front lines to gain viable resources for your fashion journey. Together, we're working to take back fashion, shift power, shift economics, shift paradigms, and create a new sustainable, ethical fashion system. Take a listen and let's accelerate fashion forward. So today we have a special guest, founder of Global Fashion Marketplace. Bukola, I'm so excited to have you on the show this season where we are discussing Africa. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Camilla. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to a really great conversation. Africa, really important topic when it comes to sustainability and the 2030 climate goals. Hopefully we can center Africa as a solution and they can be a leader for sustainability in the future. That's what my hope is anyway. Definitely down to a lot of planning and coordination, but it's more essential to get the ideas out and inspire people on what they can actually do and how they can make an impact.
Exactly. I mean, once we dive into the subject, it's going to be great because the more that you learn about Africa and the countries within Africa and what's happening there, and really even the history, like you start to see, like, wow, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start with a focus on Africa for the first season of this podcast. But before we get into the deeper conversation, I would love to know, where did you first start off in fashion and how did that take you to where you are now?
Yeah, so I'm a London-based brand and business consultant. I founded the Global Fashion Marketplace in 2016, and I wasn't really focused on sustainability at that time. I've got like 15 years experience in entrepreneurship and business development. So initially I was working a lot with startup businesses of any genre. And then I was working with some youth organizations. This was a long time ago, probably 2007 or so, to 2000. So I first touched on fashion there, working with like young designers, connecting them with music artists and things like that in the UK. And that was when I first realized that fashion businesses or young designers don't have that business acumen that they need to kind of build a strong business. And a lot of people were just kind of creative and had a creative spark, but they didn't really understand business. So that's really what triggered working with young people in that area, really triggered my interest in fashion. But I went on to just be focusing on entrepreneurship in general. And then I turned my attention mainly to fashion entrepreneurs and fashion businesses. In 2016, I set up the Global Fashion Marketplace. And that was really to help businesses reach new markets, reach new customers on an international scale. But as I worked with the fashion businesses, the big elephant in the room for me was sustainability. And I felt that I couldn't really help people build these brands, and they were doing such damage to the environment. And just there was just a lot of questions that I had about promoting and helping build brands that were just not considering people and the planet. So I kind of refocused the Global Fashion Marketplace to work specifically with sustainable brands. So I went on a bit of a sustainability journey myself, learning about what it actually means to truly be sustainable and what I need to help businesses do if they can actually be sustainable. And that was a can of worms. And so I launched a sustainable fashion podcast to kind of help people really on that journey, even on a deeper level, like just understanding concepts and understanding principles and ideas behind sustainability. And the podcast is now focused on innovation, the intersection between innovation, technology and sustainability. And we explore technology solutions for sustainable fashion and just different ways that businesses can actually be sustainable. And we look at some principles of sustainability and ethics in fashion as well, and just provide conversations that give definitions and understanding to the topic of sustainability, which actually makes it easier when consulting businesses, if they've been listening to the podcast, following the podcast, then some of the things that I'm asking of their business or recommending that they should do, they have more of a deeper understanding of why those things are important. So it's been a bit of a journey for me, learning what needs to be communicated and how, and then just bridging that gap for businesses to understand why it's important and why they should be doing that. I've recently written a book called 10 Crucial Steps to Getting Started with Sustainable Fashion. So that's a bit of a guide as well for the key important foundational things that people need to start thinking about when getting started with sustainable fashion. So they're the resources I've put together, and that's the journey I've been on, really.
As someone in fashion that's very passionate about it, and even a designer or anywhere in fashion, and then you start to go down the rabbit hole of sustainable fashion and ethical fashion, right? And, it's hard sometimes to transition from just being in the fashion industry to being into sustainable and ethical fashion because there's so many different choices that you have to make. What would you say? And I know you mentioned the book that you have, 10 Crucial Steps to Get Started. What is maybe the first steps or one of the steps that people can take that are in the fashion industry to have a sustainable, ethical business?
I think the customer is, for me, the priority and the most important thing. Without the customers, you don't really have a business. So I think understanding the customer's need and their desire for sustainable brands and not greenwashing them. So that respect for the customer and giving them exactly what they need. There's a lot of people that are into sustainability now that are doing the research and are looking for sustainable brands, but they are getting confused. They don't know who to trust. They don't know what's going into the products. There's not a lot of transparency in terms of them fulfilling their desire to get a truly sustainable brand. So I think where to start with sustainability for a business is definitely prioritizing the transparency and traceability and communicating a story or a message that a consumer can look into their brand and say, actually, this is a brand that's doing the right thing. I can check these facts. I can check this information. And I trust that I'm buying products from someone that is doing the right thing by the people and the planet. So I think for me, putting the customer at the center of what they need at the center of your business development, it's like the overarching step to everything, really.
I talk to a lot of designers and a lot of sustainable, ethical businesses. And that is so key, what you said about telling your story. Because a lot of times people are, or organizations are sustainable and they're ethical, a lot more than some of the larger organizations, but they don't necessarily know how to communicate that story to their customer. So that's great. I would recommend anyone to go read that book. And I'm sure like we could dive into that and, and have a whole episode about it. But one other thing that you mentioned about really being passionate about entrepreneurship. And I would love to know like what was your entrepreneurship journey, or why do you think entrepreneurship is so important?
Yeah, I don't know. There's this saying or question or something: "Are entrepreneurs born or are entrepreneurs made?" Um, I'm in the camp that would say entrepreneurs are definitely born, but they can be made with like obviously the right guidance. So like, but I think there's an entrepreneurial spark within some people that just causes them to want to create something and make changes to solve problems. And my entrepreneurial journey started when I was about 19. Um, I tried to start my first, it was a fashion related business actually in ethical, not ethical, ethnic jewelries and accessories. So it was with a friend of mine, we were setting up a business to import different types of jewelries and accessories from Africa and Asia and stuff and sell them in London. and it was a real learning curve. That was my first business that I tried in terms of fashion and entrepreneurship, and I learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work when you're setting up a business. And that learning curve gave me a drive to say, okay, I do want to create something. I do want to share my vision of like my creative vision with the world and kind of provide products and services that I think are meaningful to like specific audiences. And yeah, so from there, I kind of diverted a little bit to focus on brand development, my career in uni and stuff like that, do my degrees and things like that. But then once I graduated, I realized that I wanted to work for myself. So I set up my own design agency, and I was just doing brand development and things like that. And it transitioned to being business and brand development over time, because once people want a logo or a website, they don't have a business plan, they don't have a structure for how they're going to kind of make a profit of the amount of money that they're spending on a website and things like that. I just found that to be problematic. So I decided to take it upon myself to like say, oh, well, you need a business plan, you need to have this, you need to have that in place before you start building a website, designing a logo and stuff like that. So that was the journey really for me. Just seeing those challenges that other people had developing a business, and from an early age going through those challenges myself, I just felt it was my duty to kind of guide people
Yeah.
in terms of like, don't do this, do it that way. This is the quickest route. So that's how I got into consulting.
It's you said so many great things. Like, you talked about how entrepreneurs, solve problems and how they are creative. And there's so many artists or creatives that are entrepreneurs, right? And I think entrepreneurship is really a journey of self discovery, but also, figuring out like how to even do the entrepreneurship thing and make it something viable. And so just I would love to ask you, like, how do you work with people to kind of bridge that gap between, hey, I have this great idea, but now I want it to be a business? Do you think that, the way to bridge the gap is really people working together, as far as like consulting, or is there something that you do with your clients that helps to kind of move people forward on that entrepreneurship journey?
I think for me, I'm all about strategy and planning. So I think it's all good to have like a good idea, but like you need to have a roadmap of like how am I going to get from A to B. And I think that's what I'm really good at with my clients and things like that, is just like, okay, this is where you are, this is where you want to be, how are you going to get there? And then planning and mapping out the steps in order to get there. So I think a strength of mine is definitely strategic planning, strategic thinking, and making sure that people don't just stay in a creative realm, that they have like practical thoughts behind their creativity. So, for example, some people are like, oh, yeah, I want to use blockchain, or I want to make an NFT, and I want to do all this stuff with my creativity and like get my brand out there. And it's all exciting, but like, why? What is the reason you want to use blockchain? How are you going to use it? How does this application function in regards to your business? Or if you mint an NFT, what are you going to do? What is the route behind that? Is it for fundraising purposes for your business? Is it for transparency so people know exactly what goes into the product? There's just so many different reasons why you would do something. So getting clarity on the decisions that you need to make, and then choosing the right tools to kind of action your choices is what I would say I really try to focus on.
That's great. I feel like we're so much alike. And we talk so much, and we're in so many virtual rooms together, and
Yeah.
I am totally a strategy person, and absolutely love working with creatives, and helping them kind of put more structure to what their vision is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, a lot of people within the fashion industry are, and there's a lot of people that work for other people, but there are a lot of people that are launching things and wanting to launch your own brands, and I know a lot of people that listen to the podcast are founders and entrepreneurs, and they're also interested in sustainable and ethical fashion and kind of like, what can we do in the industry? I would love to ask you, kind of getting more targeted back to fashion, what are some of the biggest issues that you see facing the fashion industry right now?
Yeah, so when I started looking into sustainability, for me, the biggest problem that I found that's contributing to the whole climate crisis is the waste issue. And the waste issue, there's just like a waste aspect to so many different parts of the supply chain and parts of the production process, even the end of life of products and stuff like that. I think if the fashion industry can tackle the waste that it produces, I think would be definitely on the right path to solving some of the problems within the industry. I think there are so many problems. For me, the biggest issue is the waste, and that's where circular fashion, circularity comes into it, building circular business models that actually from the design stage waste is considered and designed out of that product. Um yeah, it's a whole process, isn't it? Like it's a whole industry change and a whole industry shift. At the moment, as you know, we have that linear process of take resources, make something, and then waste or discard it. And that's really, really problematic. The fashion industry does that at such an alarming pace with fast fashion and this disposable nature of these cheap clothing items. And yeah, I think we're onto something. If we can solve that waste problem, then everything else is just the next step, isn't it?
Yeah, so you touched on a few things, right? You talked about waste, which is, kind of the end of life of a garment, and then you touched on circularity, which kind of has to happen toward the beginning, right? Because you mentioned at the design phase, you have to start to think about circularity, right? Let's hone in on Africa, right? And what is happening there, because the first thing that I think of when I think of waste in fashion is I think of the issue where we consume so much, like the global north consumes so much of fashion and fast fashion. And then a lot of that clothing goes to the global south and different places in Africa, like Ghana, and different markets there. And that's just the picture that I have when I think of waste and I think of fashion, right? It's ingrained in
Yeah.
my head. And so maybe you can go into a little bit about that, and then I'll probably ask you a question about circularity too.
Yeah. So I think like if we look at the African context, there was some statistics that I did look at from the World Economic Forum. So the size of the textiles industry in Africa is like $1.3 trillion market. And there's like about 300 million people globally that are in that value chain. And in Africa, it's estimated to be worth up to 31 billion, employing mainly women and young people. So it's a really vast industry that we're talking about. So if we're just looking at the African context. And yeah, so there's markets like the famous, I think it's called Cantamanto market in Ghana in Accra. So that's like really the hub of where all the secondhand clothing goes to from the Western world. And Africa is really becoming like one of the world's dumping grounds. It's polluting waterways, it's just polluting like the vast landfills, it's just full of clothing, is just polluting the whole environment in Ghana, and it's really, really, really huge concern. I think for me, the solution is circularity. I think in every challenge there's an opportunity, and I think that's how entrepreneurs think about things. Africa's population is growing, so it's a youthful young population, and it's going to be probably double by 2050 compared to what it is now. So these are challenges that we need to think about when we think about the population growth in Africa, the youth of the population, and then how we are going to be managing as just as a continent our own waste management and consumption challenges that are going to come up with such a large population, not to mention the world's consumption, overconsumption, and then waste. So for me, looking at Africa in the sense of how they can lead in circularity, in recycling processes and things like that is really where the answer lies. So I think repairing, upgrading services and things like that, rental services, are kind of available in Africa on a small scale. And this is kind of like independent people doing their own little small businesses. But if Africa can look at these kind of processes and kind of industrialize or scale them up to solve the problems of the amount of waste coming in, I think that's an opportunity there. Yeah, that's just really my thoughts, really initial thoughts on that question.
You mentioned about the population growth in Africa and the youth in Africa, and you talked about NFTs a little bit, right? So I would love to kind of get your thoughts around technology and kind of the future of technology as it relates to fashion and Africa.
Yeah, I think on the ground, there's some fundamental challenges that Africa needs to overcome before it can be fully immersed into the digital world. So, constant electricity and things like that are a challenge to like actually being online, access to data and affordable data as well. I think these kind of challenges are going to kind of set Africa back in terms of being fully functional in the digital future when we talk about the metaverse and the processing power that's needed to kind of be on these applications and having access to Oculuses and all these type of things and the electricity to power all this stuff, it's not as practical. So when I think about Africa in terms of technology, I see Africa leapfrogging what the West has done. A good example of this is the mobile phone. Africa bypassed landlines and went straight to mobile phones. And then there was this idea that you can like send money using a phone. I think it started in, I'm not sure which part of Africa it was, but I think they called it Pingit. And I was at an African fintech event in London, and there was a lot of banks there and different people, and they were using Africa as a case study. This was back in I don't know, probably 2015, 2016 or something like that. It's around the time that I was launching the global fashion marketplace and looking at what I'm going to go to next in terms of sustainable fashion business consulting and things like that. And everyone was just amazed that they're using these little mobile phones to send money to people, each other, like market traders and things like that. And it's something that they developed from their limitations and their ingenuity that worked in their environment to solve their problems. So, but then it served the rest of the world, and now we've all got mobile banking, and it's a standard thing. But at the time that they were doing that, people didn't have mobile banking like that across the Western world. You had to log in on your computer and do your transactions and everything like that. So why I'm saying this is that innovation can come out of Africa and it can serve the world if Africa doesn't look at the West for the solutions or try to copy and mimic what the West is doing. If they can kind of see that these resources are available, this is what's available in my environment, these are the problems that I need to solve in my environment, they can come up with a lot of solutions that can serve the world. And that's why I use that example of the amount of waste that is coming into Africa, recycling facilities, processing facilities, things that kind of make a fortune out of someone's waste, or it doesn't make waste a resource. If they kind of that as a priority, there's so many problems that can be solved, not only in fashion, but in just general waste management and things like that. And those things can lead the world to understand that they can have sustainable practices, and this is how it's done. I think the innovation needs to come from African people solving African problems in an African way.
Yeah, that makes me think of, I believe the saying is that innovation comes from struggle. Like if life is, somewhat easy and you already kind of have everything that you need, then there's no reason to innovate, right? But if you are, you have a goal, you're trying to accomplish something and there's not a solution for you, then you will innovate, right? And so I think that's such a great point. When I was thinking of circularity, and you mentioned that it really has to start from the design, but then I think about, the overproduction is really with these larger companies are focused on. They're focused on profit. They're not focused on sustainable or ethical practices. But when I think of sustainable and ethical, I think of some of, I always hear people talk about indigenous practices or even practices right now that you'll find people from different cultures using sustainable practices or ethical practices, and that's just what it's always been, right? When you think about traditional fashion and really even like things that are luxury or making things by hand and even dyeing things with what you have. I was talking about that smaller,
More
local
production.
designer
Yeah.
or local person that is really using those traditional methods. Like, isn't that kind of the ultimate model in circularity, or is it not?
What I think it has to be like a two-pronged approach. So in terms of heritage, kind of keeping the heritage practices is important because they are sustainable, and that's what we were doing for many years. People have always worn clothes, and they've not destroyed the planet as fast as they have in the past 100 years, and probably the past 20 years, or probably 30, I would say 20 years of fast fashion really has really been really devastating. So that heritage piece is really important. Indigenous cultures have their own way of doing things and it's harmonious. And I think that's important. But when we look at the waste that is coming into Africa specifically, that's all secondhand clothing. And a lot of it is secondhand clothing that comes from fast fashion. It's so low quality that people can't actually resell it. So, what are we doing with the world's waste is for me the circularity piece. If Africa can develop collecting, like sorting services, kind of collect the waste fabrics, sort them, and kind of recycling processes and things like that on a more like a larger scale, not just specific small groups of people, but just like a process, more industrialized process of processing the waste, then they can actually export the new products that they create back out to the West. So that is entrepreneurship, isn't it? Like taking a problem and making a solution and making a profit out of that problem. It doesn't have to be polluting their environment. It doesn't have to be such a devastating situation. It's because it's not being managed. That's why it's so bad. But it can actually bring a lot of profit to Africa if they find the circular solution to solve that waste issue. So that's really my point on circularity. I think definitely natural processes, natural dyeing processes, and sustainable practices is what everybody should be doing to create products and creating products going forward. But what are we going to do with all the products that have already been created and that are still being pumped into the system and ending up as waste? That is a problem that we need to solve. So I don't think holding on to heritage and practices only is going to be a solution. I think that's like a given that people should go back to the past and see how things were done and kind of emulate those things, and in Africa specifically, holding on to your indigenous heritage kind of cultural practices when it comes to creating clothing is more important. But there is that waste, and that's where I was saying innovation comes into it, because that's where the African person entrepreneur can innovate to solve a problem. And I did say also that there's a kind of access to information. Everyone, well, a lot of people have access to the internet now through phones and things like that. So there is that connectivity of the world. People see streetwear, they see other fashion brands and fashion styles that they want to kind of wear. They see the European brands Gucci and Prada and all those kind of things, and they want to wear that too. So it's kind of like managing the fact that the African person is not just a static person, but they are an evolving culture as well. So how do they manage their heritage and culture and still participate in what is going on in the wider world? That is the question. And I think to kind of put people into a box to assume that they're only going to do things a specific way is very limiting. You need to kind of look broader at like what people's desires are for their own future or their own progression as well. But obviously cultural preservation is so important to that journey. Does that answer the question?
It does. And I think that's such an interesting angle because when you talk about the waste from the global north going to the global south, and you're like, well, the global north needs to not consume as much. But that's true, right? We have to take it from all different angles because even if we reduce overconsumption, there's still the problem of waste, right? And so what do you do with that? How do you solve the problems that are happening right now? And I love it that you took it back to entrepreneurship, and there's money to be made by coming up with solutions, right? And so just looking at what's happening now, but what solution can we do right now for this particular area, right? So I love, that this is an approach that needs to happen from all different areas, right? And whatever way that as an individual you feel like you can address it, okay, do that. There's definitely opportunities to be innovative, right in front of you with what's going on. Thanks for listening to part 1 of our conversation with Bukola, where we discuss her entrepreneurship journey and the steps you can take for your sustainable, ethical fashion business. Stay tuned for part 2, where we explore technology and innovation as it pertains to Africa and how Africa can impact the UN SDGs. See you then. Thanks for listening to Fashion Futurist Podcast. Let's take back fashion together. Like, subscribe, and share as these small actions help to spread the word and make a collaborative impact. For more ways to get involved, join me, Camila Sanders, in the Fashion Futurist community by visiting fashionfuturist.io. Let's take action and accelerate fashion forward.